We're going to let some more people come in before we start, but I'd like to take a moment to welcome everyone who's already here. Um, as I've said before, we welcome your comments on the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments. You can also email me directly at programs@albemarlehistory.org. Send us any questions you have, anything you'd like us to address on a future show. You can share that as well. Tom, do you have any announcements before we get started?
Just a few. Wanted to say that our new magazine of Albemarle Charlottesville History is out. It will be hitting your mailboxes soon, so keep an eye out for that. And if you caught that, yes, it is under a new name, the Magazine of Albemarle Charlottesville History. So we've caught up with our publications, so we're happy that we have 2018, 19, and now 2020. So in that magazine, we have an annotated transcription of an interview with Professor Paul Gaston. So historian of the American South, taught at UVA for many years, celebrated civil rights activist. And that article provides a little relevant window into his work. And what we're going to do in late February is dive a little bit deeper into his history with his children, Blaze, Chinta, and Gareth Gaston are still living and in the local community. And we're going to kind of discuss their memories of their father and some of his groundbreaking work. So that's going to come up on Wednesday, February 24th at noon. We kind of vary our times to provide for different constituents. So some like the evenings and some like the lunch breaks. So for information on that, how to register, you can find that on our website, on our calendar of events. Our board president, Dr. Shelly Murphy, who Zoom bombed us a little bit earlier here, is very busy with her genealogical work, not only for her own projects, but also with her work for the descendants of the enslaved communities at the University of Virginia. So on Tuesday, February 9th at 7 p.m., with our Ask a Genealogist program that we co-sponsor with Jmrl, she's going to be focused on African-American records, working with Miranda Burnett, who's our librarian here in the Historical Society, who's a Jmrl employee, and a special guest, Colette Blunt. So you can find registration information for that on the Jmrl website calendar. Then on Saturday, February 13th at 10 a.m., Shelly will be with the Louisa County Historical Society, telling them all about the UVA Descendant Outreach Program. So we're co-hosting that with Louisa, and you can find that information also on our calendar. And for our February speaker series, we have Professor Jelaine Schmidt. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, February 17th at 7 p.m. Her talk is From Lost Cause to Lawsuits, the Declining Political Fortunes of the Virginia Division, Sons of Confederate Veterans. Dr. Schmidt always gives a good talk, so welcome you to join us for that one. And like I said, all of our events and programs, you can check us out on Twitter and Facebook, social media pages, website. You can join our email list on our web page. And please also consider joining us as a member to support our work. So with that, with all of that, I'll send it back to Sterling.
All right, thanks, Tom. Now let's make some history. Hello, everybody. I'm Sterling Howell here with Tom Chapman of the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and we'd like to welcome you to Unregulated Historical Meanderings. When does public become public edition? This is our third unregulated, unstructured live show in which we invite some not so random person or persons this time, doing something interesting in the realm of history or culture to join us and have a casual, definitely meandering conversation about things going on of interest to our friends here in Charlottesville, Albemarle, and beyond. Our special guests today are David Plunkett and Lorenzo Dickerson. David Plunkett graduated from Charlottesville High School, received his undergraduate education from Brown University, and his graduate degree in library and information science from Louisiana State University. David has worked for the Jefferson Madison Regional Library since starting at the Gordon Avenue Library in 2002, and has been with Jmrl as has been the Jmrl Library Director since 2018. Also with us is Lorenzo Dickerson, who graduated from Western Albemarle High School and holds a BBA and an MBA from Strayer University, and is the Director of Communications in the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UVA. Lorenzo is also a filmmaker, focusing on stories of African-American history and culture. His documentaries have broadcast on PBS and shown in various film festivals, including his own Malpintown Film Festival at the Jefferson School African-American Heritage Center. He is currently working on a film tentatively titled Free and Open, about the growth of the JMRL system and its segregated past. All right, so take it away, Tom.
Well, again, I want to welcome David and Lorenzo this evening. And just first off, this May 30th, 2021 marks the centennial anniversary of the Charlottesville Public Library and the local public library system. Why is that important?
Are you asking me why public libraries are important, Tom?
Hey, it's a softball question here.
Well, it's public libraries really are the university of the people. It's a place and an institution that allows every individual to connect to the information that they need at that moment in their life. And the modern institution of the public library in America is a great equalizer. It's an opportunity for anyone to gain knowledge and learn new ways to gain knowledge, get access to new technologies, be introduced to new technologies. Also, in pre-pandemic times, it's a third space for folks to gather and congregate that is not their home and not their work. Now we've transferred some of that to the virtual realm across the country. But we've done hundreds of virtual programs and thousands of attendees since the pandemic hit. So people are still thirsting for knowledge and to really learn these new tools in order to access information. The public library, I mean, maybe it would never happen today. It's kind of a crazy idea, right? Like, let's get together, share our money, and set up a place where anybody can come in for free and learn whatever they want to. So Jmrl's mission reflects that. The mission statement is Jmrl fosters personal growth and lifelong learning for all by connecting people with ideas, information, and each other. So public libraries are kind of a truly democratic space for people to grow, learn, and connect, to exchange ideas. And it's something to celebrate. It's 100 years of that ideal and its growth, but you can't tell that story without telling the truth about it. Because that mission that I just read wasn't upheld in 1921 when the McIntire Building went up and the first Charlottesville Public Library was formed. So Jmrl now couldn't just throw up a banner and say, yay, good for us, 100 years of library service, good for this community, without being honest about what that history looked like and whose lives were affected, and having to tell the true story about the barriers to access that existed and were baked into the institution from the very beginning of the institution in Charlottesville. So it's important to celebrate where the library is today and what it offers the community, and what the community, it's a community institution. It belongs to the people of Charlottesville, Albemarle, Greene, Louisa, and Nelson, but it's also important to really understand our past and how the community got where it is and how the library transformed along with it.
So Lorenzo, with your project, you're looking at this 100-year history, but from what vantage point are you kind of looking at it?
So in general, with this project, you're going to get the general history of the library, how it came about, the different programs, the different branches as well, which is amazing. But you're also going to get the history of segregation in the public library system here locally. You're going to hear firsthand experiences from community members throughout the years, as well as from former employees. So you're going to get really a robust story of the history of the public library system here in Charlottesville, Albemarle, and what that meant for various different people.
So your title, Free and Open. So that's kind of the public aspect of it.
Yes, it's actually free and open to the public. And I can't take credit for that. David actually came up with that title.
Make sure I get a line, the credit at the end of the movie.
Sounds good.
It'll fly by the screen real quick. But also kind of coming back to that word public. You know, we're celebrating 100 years of the public library, but really, is it 100 years of it being a public institution? I throw that out to both of you.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's the interesting piece of the story, right? And that rings true for all of the American South, right? During that time period whether we talk about, you know, public schools or theaters and stores and that sort of thing. So in this case, Gordon Avenue was opened as desegregated space in '66. Of course, you know, that's when a lot of things was going on during that time. Charlottesville City started to desegregate in '59. Albemarle County desegregated between '63 and '67. So it's right in that time period when things really became free and open to the public for all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the library system looks at 1947, 48. In 1947, the catalog and lending privileges were open to the whole community, and which hadn't been up until that point. And in 1948, the segregated library was closed. So in theory, you could point to the 1948 day and say, well, here the library is desegregated and the reading room at the McIntire Library is now open to the public. But what would that have looked like in reality? You know, so while you can point to that date and say, oh yeah, this is when the library desegregated, what would it have meant for an African-American family to walk into the McIntire Building in 1948, which had been a segregated building at that point for almost 30 years, and ask for service? So these are the types of stories that I'm really excited to have Lorenzo looking at, and you know, we're losing generations of knowledge about. So this is a great time for this project, and I wish we could have done this every 10 years, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Let me jump in here for a second. Tom, if you don't mind,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to push that issue a little further. You guys threw out a lot of dates there, and I think the 100 years is a nice round number and a nice little milestone to celebrate. But when we ask the question of when public became public, we're going to have a really hard time pinning that down, aren't we? Because there's a big gray area. I was looking through some old Daily Progress articles today, and one from 1962 was speaking back to 1950s. And a man by the name of James Pickering was appointed librarian director in 1953, but then departed in 1958. 58 was in that time frame you guys were talking about. Quote, after extended strife over his appointment of the first Negro in a capacity involving direct service to the public. So even after there was services extended to African Americans in the neighborhood, there still was a lot of, there was still segregation within the system, but on different levels.
Yeah, absolutely. That employee was Donna Reeves, and she was the wife of the principal, Booker T. Reeves of Jefferson Elementary School. And this is one of the stories that I would love to see teased out a little bit here, because the resignation of the director the next year, it's a one-line resignation. I was also looking at that today, Sterling, where he just says, I'm done here, basically. So it's unclear, you know, what the politicking was, but I know that there were numerous petitions that went around in 1957 when the director Pickering attempted to hire Ms. Reeves. She would have been not the first African-American employee of the library system, but the first one working in what had been the whites-only McIntire Building. So I think Lorenzo might have hit a nail on the head there when he said 1966 when Gordon Avenue opened. And I know when I started working at Gordon Avenue in 2001, there was still a generation of patrons and employees that were familiar with the opening of that branch and how it was viewed by some in the community as being the first desegregated library. Even though the McIntire Building was in theory desegregated in 48, this one was the first one that was opened explicitly as everyone can come in here.
So then with that period, I think it was 21, maybe to 34 or no, 34 to 48, maybe, with the Jefferson School.
Yeah.
There was a branch there. So that was kind of the separate but equal kind of library branch in Charlottesville at the time.
Yeah, and if you look at the closure of that, it was strictly a monetary decision. It wasn't out of the sense of enlightenment or growth on anybody involved in that decision making. It was the community that was using that library really pushing for better facilities and better resources, saying, you know, it's supposed to be equal, and the space is falling apart, and we don't get access to any of the materials. And the library board at the time basically making a monetary decision in which they said, okay, we're going to shutter it. And now the library system is open to everybody. And I believe that they just fired anybody that was employed there, and stated that you can come use the McIntire Building downtown if you want to use library services.
So it was very much in the vein of a lot of different Southern institutions of it was separate, but not equal.
Correct.
And then you mentioned, so with JMRL, it's more than just Charlottesville now. So it was originally the Charlottesville Public Library, 1921 through, I guess, the 70s. I mean, when did JMRL become, you know, its little realm of a regional in there?
Jmrl was formed in the 70s, although the library system actually went through several different names in that time. I'll throw some more dates out at you since I have them written in front of me here. And if anybody wants more information, I'm happy to email this out.
Sterling's writing it all down, probably. So if anyone has any interest, we'll get it to you.
All this, I'll make sure Lorenzo gets all this in the film as well. So service began in 1921 as a whites only library in the McIntire Building, land and building and collection donated by Paul Goodloe McIntire. The first branch, so the first extension outside of that building, was in the Jefferson School in 1934, and that was a segregated facility. That was closed in 1948. The first extension service outside of Charlottesville was actually a bookmobile that went driving around Albemarle and then Fluvanna counties. Fluvanna is not currently part of JMRL, but it was the first non-Charlottesville Albemarle county to get service, extension services that way. That began in 46, and Fluvanna added on in 53. The name changed to Charlottesville Albemarle in 1947 when that bookmobile started to go out into Albemarle County. So it's the Charlottesville Albemarle Library then. The Albemarle branches followed, with the Scottsville branch opening in 1960. It had had only bookmobile service and kind of local efforts at libraries from Scottsville itself. Same in Crozet in 64. The name changed again to the McIntire Library in 1958. So it was known as the McIntire Public Library. And stayed that way until Greene, Louisa, and Nelson each looked to add their own library branches that were part of this system. And in 1972, the library system was formed as the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library System. The state, at that point, incentivized jurisdictions to get together and share resources here. There was more money coming from the state, the more jurisdictions that got involved in library services. And that's still the case today, although the state is not funding it at the rate that's promised by state law. That's a whole other webinar. So now JMRL serves an area that's about the size of the state of Delaware, which is one of my favorite tidbits. There's a truck that goes around 7 days a week across that whole area in order to share the collection.
The one part outside of our office?
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
We've got some questions coming in, if you guys don't mind.
Sure.
You could say there are two sides of the same question. One is, was the intent of Mr. McIntire to have the library be open to all? Was it his intent for it to be open to all? And another question is, was the library required by law to be segregated?
I don't know if it was required by law. That's a good question from Sandy, and something that we should look into as we're working on this centennial, what the legal status was at the time. And to Shelly's question about whether or not Mr. McIntire intended the library to be open for all, I haven't seen anything in any of the City of Charlottesville's minutes or the library board's minutes that places any sort of restrictions from Mr. McIntire in that sense. But I do know that in his other gifts around town that he was a staunch segregationist, and that Lorenzo and I were talking about the park system, right? And how you want to take that, Lorenzo? He donated the land for multiple parks.
Sure. So of course he donated the land for formerly Park and Washington Park, and of course, I guess the donation for the McIntire Building. All this donating happened right at the same time period, and of course, the parks were to be specifically segregated, with Booker T. Washington being the park for African Americans. So yeah, and I haven't seen anything in particular either about the library spaces specifically supposed to be segregated, but as David said, with his other donating, it kind of falls in line.
So I'd like to come back to what you're doing, Lorenzo, with the film. Like, where are you in the process of putting that film together? I mean, we've bounced around a bunch of dates and thoughts and this and that and bookmobile. I mean, there seems like there's a lot of opportunities that people have had to interact with what the library has been over the years. How are you reaching out to these folks? How are you getting the stories you need?
Yeah, so we've been reaching out to a lot of folks, and of course, I mean, we're talking about expansive time period, right? So we're not just talking about in previous films we may have been talking about that I've done before, desegregation of Paramount Theater or Albemarle County Schools and so on, where you have more of a finite space there. So this is definitely expansive. So reaching out to folks and really looking for stories, and it doesn't have to be any particular story, but we're really looking for experiences, personal experiences, whether it be back into even the 30s and 40s and 50s up until today. Like I said, we're talking to former employees. The thing that really drew me to this project when David and Krista brought it to my attention was really just my own experience with the library. Being that I'm from the county, I spent a lot of time at Central Library growing up in the 80s. I was telling David actually earlier today about learning the computer on an Apple IIe computer that they had. They would do these classes in the kids area at Central Library in the 80s on an Apple IIe. So you would go there on Saturdays and they would spend an hour and you would go through and learn this computer. And I must have been about 5 or 6 years old at the time, but I never forget that experience. My parents taking me there every weekend.
Well, that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool experience and memory. Like, yeah, I guess it's just trying to figure out, how to make those connections with those folks. Are you having any luck? I mean, what can we do to help you? I mean, we got a bunch of people here and the participants that, probably would be able to hopefully drum up some help and support for you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Definitely are having some luck with speaking to folks about their experiences, but there's definitely work to do. So if anyone does have an experience that they would like to share, if they know of someone that they think would be good for me to speak with for this film, please let me know. You can email me at lorenzo.dickerson@gmail.com. And I'll be glad to speak with anyone about their experiences, history that they're familiar with about the library system. It doesn't have to be Central Library. It can be any of the library branches.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to, if I know a lot of this history just from having worked here for a while and having access to our documentation and just the institutional memory. But if Lorenzo only listened to the folks that I said, oh, you should talk to this person, and this person, it would end up being a film about what the library staff thinks about what the library has done in the last 100 years, which is, I'm sure, an interesting film, but not exactly what we're going for here. This is truly a community institution. It belongs to the people of Charlottesville, Albemarle, Green, Louisa, and Nelson, and we want to hear their stories about it.
Anything in particular stand out, like in terms of a story that you really want to tell, like that has a prominence that, just kind of represents what you want as the centennial?
There's a bunch of stories that I would like to hear, but whether or not our pulling on threads are going to get them, I'm not sure. But events like this and just talking to people in the community will help. But that story of that 4th Street branch Basically, it was open for 12 years there, and there were back-to-back librarians in charge, both named Allen, Ethel Allen, followed by Dorothy Allen. I would love to hear that story about, or see images. You know, we have some photographs of the McIntire Building, not quite that early, but you know, we have photographs of the Central Library when it first came in, but I don't have in our archives any pictures of that 4th Street Library. So to hear that story of the people who used it and the people who were there, I think that first bookmobile service in 1948, a bus driving around Albemarle and Fluvanna dropping off books for people. I mean, I would love to hear stories about where that went and who used that service and how it worked. You know, I think that the Charlottesville Bridge Builders program recently put out some work, and Benjamin Bunn was mentioned in Kay Slaughter's book about this. And anecdotally, his wife says that he integrated the central, I mean, not the Central Library, but the McIntire Library. I'm pointing behind me because I'm at the Central Library. And I don't have any documentation on that, but there have to be stories out there. If that happened and people are aware of it, then that reverberates. Something like that ripples to get us to where we are today. So Donna Reeves, we mentioned that the first African-American employee who worked in the Central, the McIntire Library there. I mean, that story, as Sterling mentioned, it was a huge news story. There were all these letters to the editor about, like, why would the library hire a Negro, as it was called at the time? And there were letters asking for the librarian's resignation, to fire her, to get rid of the library board. And at the same time, also lots of kerfluffle about the fact that there were 190 books in the collection that had the word Russia in the title. So it was an interesting time for anyone involved in the library system then. There was a fire at the Scottsville Library in 1980 that destroyed that building. And a lot of people in Scottsville remember that. It's not the current library building. It had to be built after that fire, but I'm sure that there are stories about, I mean, it razed it to the ground, basically. A lot has talk here about in this building. I'm in the McIntire, I'm in the Central Library, which was the formal federal building, a courthouse here. And there was a very famous court case that took place, the Gregory Swanson case, where the first African-American was admitted to UVA's law school. And the arguments there were done by Thurgood Marshall, Oliver Hill, Martin A. Martin, Spotswood Robinson on behalf of the NAACP. So it was really some of the underpinnings for Brown versus the board happened right here in downtown Charlottesville. There are a million of those. So some of those we have more documentation than others. I would love to tell stories about our Friends of the Library, which is one of the most successful in the country. They have a book sale tradition that's been going on for decades that raises hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. So, you know, every place we turn around the library, it's kind of a library pun that it's full of stories, right? So those are a few.
You've mentioned a number of names, but I can't help but realize there's a lot of female names.
Sure.
So in terms of how, like, the staff, what's the gender? I mean, we talked about racial kind of equality or inequality, but in terms of how the library has changed over time in that 100 years, are there roles that have changed also along gender lines because of what people were allowed to do in the library?
Yes, certainly. I mean, librarianship has been primarily, I think when you look at the numbers over the years, there have been more female employees in public librarianship. But as in a lot of other institutions, you know, the folks that are in charge sometimes happen to be or were male, while there were a lot of female employees working under them. So lots of title changes, lots of different positions, but you're talking about something that grew from really only one paid employee. There was a long period of time where the library board president was also in charge of the library, and it was a volunteer position. To now where we have 125 some employees in the regional library system.
So Lorenzo, any stories stick out for you that you've kind of come across and you're trying to figure out how to weave into your larger storyline?
For sure. One that sticks with me is the fact that the post office was in the same building, right? Was in the building that is now Central Library. And that's interesting for me because folks would register for the military there in that post office space. So there are stories of folks graduating from high school, graduating from Burley High School, and going straight there to the post office and signing up for the military. and having careers in the military for years. So that's one that stands out to me. And of course, I see the question in the chat about, and David mentioned the Gregory Swanson case, but that will be in the film as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also interesting in terms of not just looking at the library as a system, as a community organization, but it also, like, there's a sense of place. Like, I'm sitting here in the middle of the main room of the McIntire Building, which was the Charlottesville Public Library, many names, Mr. McIntire, this side over my shoulder. But, you know, it's changed its use now. That's the Historical Society, still library, research and knowledge focused. But then the interesting aspect of the Central Library is the courthouse, post office, and now the place of knowledge. So I think there's multiple ways in which you can tackle, you know, how people are interacting, not only with the thing, but the space itself.
There's a jail in one of the offices on the 3rd floor of one of the administrative offices has a holding cell in it. So it was definitely not intended to be a library when this building was constructed, unless we were to take,
You know, some of those
fines.
librarians back in the
Yeah.
day, I mean, they were pretty strict, right?
Take the overdue fines to its endpoint.
What was the one you found, Sterling?
Oh yeah, I found a story of a I can't remember the name. I think it might have been Fowler, lady who was appointed librarian director and only served for a few months. And as I got deeper into the story, I found out that she resigned because of the limited space and working conditions. But the interesting part was that one of her first acts as the director was to report 56 library patrons to the police for not returning their books. And I forget how many, but I think it was like 8 individuals actually had to go to court for that. So she was the librarian I wouldn't want to run into.
No longer library policy.
Well, you got the holding cell just in case.
Yeah, this is true.
I want to throw out another number, 1823. What does that mean to you?
That's when the subscription library started in the community here. A group of citizens got together, and it was in Court Square, right at the number 0 in Court Square. Jefferson was rumored to be part of that group. So it was, you know, you could look at that as the beginnings of library service in the area. That is for the community, not for the university only. You know, that it's not a public institution at that point, in the sense that it's not publicly funded. It's a subscription service. You have to be a member in order to have access to it. So while that's a big landmark in terms of access to information, it was very limited in scope.
So we've batted around the idea of talking about, you know, defining public. Is there any kind of one thought, one idea, maybe even a person that kind of stands out? Like you mentioned the Benjamin Bunn idea of, you know, that there's an interest there in terms of maybe he was helping integrate the library. But is there anyone else that kind of stands out that, you know, that we probably will have front and center and kind of looking at this 100 years, or looking at what has transpired over the past 60 odd years in terms of that true integration?
Yeah, I think that the instance that Sterling mentioned with the director Pickering and Donna Reeves, you know, that story, that those 2 individuals really kind of changed the way that the library did business of the library as an organization, not necessarily as a public good. Benjamin Bunn, as we mentioned, hopefully there's a thread here that we're going to pull on in the next few months that will give us that whole story. Yeah, one thing about the library system, I mean, there's no, so the question is there like a Charlottesville 12 for the library? I mean, that would be the closest one, but we don't have as much information about Mr. Bunn's in this specific. That's an anecdotal story. And unfortunately, he and his wife are no longer with us. But the library in and of itself has had so many different individuals that have each kind of picked up the ball and taken it for a while, whether for good or for ill, whether they're taking people to court for library fees, or they are making sure that the new branch that gets opened is a not a segregated facility in 1966, which was still iffy in the Charlottesville area. So I think that to me it's a continuity. There's not a single individual or time or whatnot. I think the 100-year centennial is important because we're talking about the first time that tax dollars went into this service to the community. So every other community in America really has their own or access to a neighboring public library of some sort, and they usually don't come from a benefactor the way that this library system points to McIntire as being like he gave the money for the building and whatnot. Most of them point to their municipality. They point to their neighbors and the taxpayers that are there. And that's really, to me, the truth of the founding. Yes, the building came from McIntire, but then it was the community that through taxation paid for it for 100 years after that, and is continuing to pay for it today.
That's why I just think it's so important in the work that I do with in film, with leaning on the elders in the community and their wisdom, because these folks are still around. This history, it can seem like it's a long time ago, but it's really not. And a lot of the folks that lived this history they're still here, and they're still here to share these stories. So yeah, leaning on the elders in the community and really learning that history firsthand from those who experienced it.
Can I say how lucky we are to have Lorenzo as part of this project, but just in our community in general? One of the things that we talked about today is how is the library gonna commemorate this 100 years, and this film is definitely the big event. We would have loved to have premiered it at Lorenzo's festival or to have a big showing, and who knows where we'll be in terms of physical programming midsummer when it's done. But I first became aware of Lorenzo's work because he was showing and here talking about his film, The Coachman, at the Central Library, and I attended it, and he connected you immediately with the best type of kind of local public history, like real stories that resonate over time. And especially as a Charlottesville native myself, that film really moved me. And I thought, if anybody's going to tell the story of what this public institution means, it's going to be Lorenzo. So this is a huge event for our whole community, and we're really looking forward to being able to share it with everyone. And you can check out Lorenzo's films from Jmrl. You can come in, make an appointment, or do curbside to pick up the DVDs of his previous films.
Yeah, you are currently just in curbside, correct?
No, we are at appointment. We are in tier 3 of our COVID response. So at all of our branches, you can call and make an appointment. Masks are required. You'll have to go through a screening questionnaire as you come in, and it's limited, only 45 minutes that you can be in any branch. But we are free and open to the public once again, with certain restrictions.
Yeah, just a little side note. I was sitting out in Market Park, or what was Lee Park, and watching this gentleman very quickly, not running, but walking very fast down the sidewalk and up to the other side of the library. And then he came back that way very slowly with his nose in a book. And, he just wanted to get to the library. So this goes into personal stories, like you were saying, Lorenzo, about like you remember as a kid, the computer that you worked on there. So where we are in COVID, where we are in kind of, thinking through this public service, how is it making you all think about what a library is? Libraries are, full of books usually. At least that's the correlation that people make. It's a bibliophile's, dream. Look, but there's so many other things that the library provides.
Yeah, I saw one of our attendees earlier was Jmrl's collections manager, who frequently tells me to replace the word books in my mind with the word information every time I'm thinking about what public libraries do. So connecting people to books is connecting people to information, and checking out books is checking out information, and helping people access books is helping people access information. Because to the library, the format can change. It might be a book, might be a downloadable book, it might be a program, it might be a display. But our goal is the same, to connect the public to the information that they need and to remove barriers to access to that information. So, the library was kind of uniquely positioned at the beginning of the pandemic because we've been checking out ebooks and e-audiobooks for years before this. In fact, it was our fastest growing kind of circulation collection in terms of like year over year growth than anything that we had. So we weren't prepared for the total shutdown where everybody would be checking things out because out of the 500,000 items that have checked out since July, 150,000 of those have been electronic. So just in the last like 6-month period, basically, and that's about 44% more than it was the year before. And that kind of growth is there. But we find that most people are either device agnostic, where they want the material, what's fastest? Can I get the book, or can I get the ebook, or can I get the e-audiobook? Whichever one they can get first is the one that they want. Or they have a preference either for electronic materials or for paper materials. We have plenty of people who, I can't read that stuff, I just want it on paper. So this has definitely stretched library budgeting over the years, because you used to just have to buy a book and you kept it for a period of years, then you gave it to the friends of the library and they sold it to support programming. But now you got to buy the book. You still have to buy the book on CD because in a lot of our communities, there's no digital access and folks are driving around and need access to the materials. And you got to buy it maybe in large print for folks who need that, and a digital copy and the digital e-audio copy. So we've been working on this for a long time. The big shift has been in programming, figuring out virtual programming overnight, basically, for us. And our staff has done an amazing job of turning around our normal programming into a digital version of it, and then programming specifically for a digital audience. And the trick is going to be to figure out how to combine those things moving forward, because there are some aspects of digital programming that people are going to want to be able to sit at home and watch something like this while you're also drinking coffee or eating your dinner. And some people are going to want to be able to bring their kids into story time. So figuring out how to mesh those things moving forward is one of the big challenges.
How have you seen that, Lorenzo, with filmmaking in terms of just this explosion of digital access? Like, does it take away from the sense of, I produce something and here it is and you go see it, just because we're inundated with, images, and I'm looking at you on a screen as we speak. So it's trying to understand, like, how has that changed your idea of filmmaking?
Yeah, it's definitely changed distribution of film for sure. I mean, it's always nice to have a physical premiere of a film and have people all watch it together in the same space for the first time. That's always a nice experience. The last time I did that was at the Paramount in August before last with the last film, which was great. But with the pandemic, for example, Town Film Festival this past July was completely virtual. Because we weren't able to be in the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. But what that ended up doing was taking the film festival global. So folks from all over the world were watching these films and seeing them for the first time, not necessarily together in the same space. But they were seeing these films for the first time and hearing these unique stories from various different filmmakers for the first time. And this past summer, the theme for the film festival was Queen. It was all about films by and or about African-American women. So a lot of these films people had not seen, but they really learned a lot. And people from the UK, from Mexico, from California, from Argentina were all watching these films, which we've never been able to have that kind of reach before in the physical space.
So you take a local story that has resonance on a global scale. I mean, that's pretty darn cool, I think.
Yeah, very, very cool. And then of course, Dave and I was talking about this before, it's going to be interesting when the pandemic is over and when we're able to go back into these spaces. The digital aspect of it is always going to have to be considered. Even when we're back in the theater, we're probably going to have to be virtual and in person at the same time.
Mm-hmm. It just adds a necessary complexity to that outreach, to be able to connect with people. I mean, hopefully, within a few years, we get over this particular pandemic and we can put it behind us and say, wow, that was crazy. But still, it's probably something that's going to live on in the society and how we look at things and how we interact. So it's definitely kind of a marker moment, I would say, in terms of what we looked at before and what we look at after, and how we, it's a blessing and a curse in a sense, because it's opened up the opportunity for that outreach, but it's making us really kind of reticent about, what that means, because it's such an unknown, I guess.
For sure.
I've had certain experiences, and it just popped in my head with talking with people, doing oral histories, interacting at Montpelier, where I worked for many years, and I did the displays and the oral history work for the segregated train depot that was there, that was built by the Southern Railway for William DuPont. And trying to interview folks and gather information, you kind of get a little bit of pushback sometimes, because people look at you and say, well, why do you want to know that? Have you experienced that at all? Maybe not with the library, but with other parts of other things you've done, or has it been, have you seen more of an open-minded kind of, let's talk about this, I want to get my story out?
Yeah, for sure. I haven't, luckily I haven't seen that with this particular film, but in the past, for sure, with plenty of times, with folks being reluctant to share their story. Also, folks are camera shy. They may even want to tell their story, but don't want to necessarily tell it on camera. And there have been stories that I have known about and have talked with folks about, but that I haven't. My biggest regret is that I wasn't able to capture it on camera, and now that person is no longer with us to share that story. And that's part of this work, is being able to capture these stories before we're not able to capture them any longer, because, being able to read it on paper and find that research is one thing, but being able to hear it directly from that person is just a different type of experience, and it really brings you in. So really wanting to do that as much as possible. And of course, the pandemic changes a lot of that as well. Even with doing interviews, and we're no longer, lavalier miking folks anymore, just using shotgun mics, and, your distance, and you're not going in folks' homes like you used to. Previous films, it's very interesting to be in individual homes, and being able to see what those backgrounds are like, who are in those photos that are on the wall behind that individual, what types of books are on the bookshelf that are important to that person that may speak to their story. So a lot of times you're not able to get a lot of that now, but hopefully things will clear up and change so we can do some of that.
When you were saying that, it just brought to mind like some of the reality shows that exist out there that have worked through the COVID pandemic, where they couldn't have the production crew and the camera crew there. So they gave the people who they are part of the show the cameras and everything, and they, did the show. You ever thought about doing that? Like, give somebody a camera and say, hey, walk around your house and talk about the things that I want you to tell me about. Maybe I'll be on the phone with you and you can,
I haven't. That's a good idea. We have done some, like walk around filming outside, so folks can show you, what the neighborhood looked like, and where things were in a certain time period and that type of thing. So that's interesting, but I haven't thought about giving them a camera. That's an interesting thought. I have to jot that down for sure.
Or maybe even just like a GoPro, so it's not like too, technical. It's like you just, hit the button and look at it. You might have to edit a lot of things out because you don't want to.
This is so interesting to me to hear Lorenzo talk about this basically like added degree of difficulty to his job, to what he does there, because we all have experienced it. Everybody on this call has experienced it as they try to go through their normal lives. And from the library standpoint, I know like how much harder and how much longer things take, and then how we had to reinvent everything there. So it's fascinating to me, Lorenzo, to hear about the details of like what you have to do now in order to get to what would have been a phone call before.
Yeah.
Just go into somebody's house. Mhm.
For sure. Yeah, it's to the point where when you even set up an interview with someone, it's kind of like you push it out further. You could have just gone and got that interview next week,
Yeah.
but instead you say, well, let's schedule this at the end of February, or let's schedule this, and we'll see how it pans out, and we'll go to a neutral space that's open.
Outside, yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions that have popped up, Sterling?
We do. We have another question from Shelly for both David and Lorenzo. What do you want the key takeaway to be, either from the library's exhibit or from your film, Lorenzo? What would be the key takeaway of this 100-year history?
So maybe I can speak to the kind of centennial, and Lorenzo can speak to the film. And I don't think I've mentioned or maybe I have, but the Historical Society is working in partnership with Jmrl to put up an exhibit on the third floor of the Central Library that goes through some of this history of the regional library service in the area. So kind of starting with 1921 and service in a segregated Charlottesville and the 4th Street branch, and then going through the branches and expansion of the regional library system, the Swanson case, and some things like that. And that actually came out of a working group that we put together all virtually last year that was looking at naming the large meeting room at the Central Library the Gregory Swanson courtroom case, the Swanson case courtroom, which has happened, but nobody can use the room, so nobody has seen it yet. The signage is changing, but there was a discussion there. Members of the public said, well, I don't know all this history. I don't like, the library staff are well versed in it, but it's not generally accessible. So I think for me, the takeaway of the centennial and what we really want to get out there is kind of where the organization is now. It's a free and open to the public. It's an institution for the community that's paid for by the community, that's supported by the community, and that exists in order to give access to information and remove barriers to that access. But at the same time, understanding that that's the current organization, but this is an institution. It's a public institution. And while we have the smiling faces that are a part of it now, there's also the kind of looming larger idea of the public library here that that has a story that needs to be told. And you can't just, as I said earlier, throw up a banner and say, yay. You have to really look at, well, who did get service and what effects did a barrier to access to information have? And when you talk about segregated schools, when the time the McIntire Library went up, you talk about redlining, and you talk about basically power structures that were in place to make sure that generational wealth and generational knowledge weren't passed on to the Black community. You have to be honest about where the library's place was in that, and you should celebrate the strides that were made in order to remove those barriers, but you can't do that without talking about the barriers. So Shelly, that's my main thing that I want to get across is to here's where we are now, but here is the 100 years that it took. Well, it's been a continuum, as I said. So here are the many years that it took to get to this point.
Yeah,
Lorenzo?
For me, I have this, always have this longing for folks to really understand spaces as we walk past them and experience them day in and day out as we live in this local area. For me, there's so many places here locally that we walk past and we experience and we go to, and we have no clue about the real history of it. Because there's no, blaring Vegas sign outside that's just telling us, hey, check this out. Make sure you look at this. And to me, the public library system here locally is probably the most vibrant and important living, breathing system outside of the public school system that we have, that touches so many people and has for so many years. So it's important that as we go into these spaces, into these library branches and experience them and gain the information that the libraries provide, that we look at it differently. So I want folks to see the film, and then the next time they go to the library physically, or the next time they're online, that they just think about their experience a little bit differently because they may have heard or remembered one story from the film that someone shared.
Yeah, it brought to mind as you were talking, David and Lorenzo, that we were talking about John Lewis, the late representative, and his experience growing up. And I was at Troy, Alabama, and going to the library and not being allowed to enter the library, not being able to go there. And that how that had such a profound impact on his life. And I think he was like 8 years old or something. So just at a very young age. And the amazing part of that in terms of it's a negative in the sense of how you look at it from his perspective and how that shaped him, but also being able to turn that into a positive in terms of the experiences we've all had with libraries. I mean, I had the George Mason Regional Library in Fairfax County. It was right down at the end of my street where I grew up in Annandale, Virginia, and I lived in that library. You know, if I wasn't in my house, I was down at the library, and it just opened up doors and avenues to knowledge that, you know, in many cases, you know, if you didn't have the library, where would you get that?
Yeah, I think that story about John Lewis really is a great nutshell of to answer Sterling's question or Shelly's question about, you know, what we want the takeaway to be here. So he went to the library and was told he couldn't come in and didn't go back until 1998 when he was doing a book signing because he was a best-selling author at that point as well. And that was the first time he'd been back in a public library in 40 plus years because he wrote off that institution. It's not there for me. And after that, he was quite the champion for libraries, frequently at American Library Association conferences. And you know, of course, he won numerous awards for March and his trilogy of graphic novels. So it just speaks volumes to me about how, you know, that individual is so important in American history, wrote off this institution because it was not for him. And then when he finally got around to saying, oh, okay, what's here? He realized, oh, well, this is actually like a very democratic place that we can allow everybody in and everybody has a chance to connect to their own information. But his story would have been one of the ones that we would be looking for now, you know, that access to information and the barriers that were there were so great that it took 40 years to overcome it.
Okay, guys, we're running out of time, but I'm dying to follow up on that with a philosophical question to both David and Lorenzo.
This is where we get the meandering from sometimes.
Yeah, that's my job. All right, so we've talked about what a library is and does and what the ideal of it is. You've talked about information, knowledge, and access. You just went through that great story. So a very big question and as simplistic an answer as you can. Does knowledge create power, or does power determine what knowledge is and who's allowed to have it?
Does knowledge create power, or does power determine what knowledge is and who has it? So yes. My answer would be that that knowledge might create some power, definitely, but that power creates information and controls information. So it's not true knowledge yet, it's the spread of information. True knowledge is earned, it's when you add experience to information and you can really pass that on. As Lorenzo's been talking about, you get the older generation that has true knowledge because they have the information. I gave you all these dates today, but they can add the experience to it to make it knowledge and wisdom, which can be passed on generationally. So I would say that power controls information and creates a lot of it to get it out there, but that true knowledge comes from experience.
Nice. Anything to add, Lorenzo?
I would say that we're moving, as time goes on, with access, we're moving from one to the other. So power would have informed knowledge even more so in a different time period before us. But with access, knowledge is even becoming more powerful because it's becoming more accessible to everyone. So for instance, if I was a filmmaker in 1950 I probably wouldn't be. And you would never see this film, and you would never see any of the other films, because I wouldn't have the power to create that for you to be able to see it. So I think we're moving from one to the other, luckily, prayerfully. So in this time period, you're seeing a whole lot more of these types of stories and this type of information that's being disseminated to folks, because you don't have to be a certain person in order to make these types of films or write these articles or share this type of knowledge.
Great answer.
Great answer. Thank you.
I just got a text from somebody who's watching here who I'm related to, who worked in the special collections department at the university for many years. And they tell me, Lorenzo and Sterling, that the Benjamin Bunn papers are at special collections. So we can go and see what we can find there about this story. Well, actually, we might not be able to go. We might have to find somebody who's on the inside there to give us access.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great information.
Yeah, definitely.
That was what I was hoping part of this this program would help us out with, in terms of finding those threads so that we can pull on them and see what happens.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, well, that's right. You come from a librarian generational background, I guess.
Well, I don't know if 2 makes sense.
Well, I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah, it's not bad.
But no, I mean, this has been great, and just I think very much the history of the library, looking at the centennial year, can in microcosm kind of look at the larger community history too, in terms of understanding, if you, all the dates that we threw around, but if you go at 1823 and just simply say it was a subscription library, but also 1823, it was allowed only for white males. And, you know, gender differences and racial differences, and, you know, slavery, you know, not even allowing to be able to read and write. And then where we look at now in terms of where we've come, not that it's, you know, a progressive line of improvement, but that it's helping us get to, you know, a more democratic understanding of how we share this knowledge, and that with knowledge comes power. And, you know, that opens up a door in terms of asking, well, we'll leave that for another topic in terms of the Jefferson Madison Regional Library and what that name may mean or may change, or in terms of what those people may mean. But I think it's one of those cases where you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a nuanced story that you have to tell. And they did some very important things for our country, but at the same time, you have to look at them as real human beings with all of their problems. And so, any more questions there, Sterling, or are we?
No, Tom, it's 7:33. I think that's enough meandering for one evening.
You go.
But before we go, again, we invite any suggestions you have on where we meander from here. Send us your ideas for future guests, future topics, whatever you've got, leave it in the comments or email me at programs@albemarlehistory.org. Don't forget to mark your calendars for February 17th at 7 p.m. for Jelaine Schmidt speaking about From Lost Cause to Lawsuits, the declining political fortunes of the Virginia Division Sons of Confederate Veterans. And February 24th at noon, when we'll speak to the children of UVA history professor Paul Gaston about his experiences in Charlottesville during the 1950s and 60s. You can check out all of our upcoming events on our website calendar. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube by searching at ACHISTSOC. Also, don't forget, you can check out Lorenzo's films at Jmrl. And I believe that's all I wanted to say. So thank you all. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, David. Unregulated Historical Meanderings is brought to you by the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society and all of our wonderful supporters like you. I'm Sterling Howell here with Tom Chapman, and we hope to see you at the next Unregulated Historical Meanderings. Until then, meander on.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Take care, everyone.
Have a great night.
Night.